Scandinavia, they got these tables that you stand around.
Right, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that all of you are still here after a long day of heavyweight and intellectual discussions. My name is Agnieszka Kolek and I'm a head of cultural engagement here at MCC Brussels. I moved to Brussels from Poland, from Warsaw, where I was a deputy head at Ujazdowski Castle Center for Contemporary Art in Warsaw. And here in Brussels, I do hope to build a network, which in a sense is kind of almost like my whole life, of building a network of free-thinking artists and people engaged in culture. In London, where I lived for 20 years, I co-founded and curated an art festival called Passion for Freedom, where we build that network of artists that are not afraid to create art and to challenge the status quo and you know, cheekily say to upset a lot of people in different circles. And I also survived a terror attack in Copenhagen during discussion on art and blasphemy law. So in a sense, we could say that I also experienced the cultural enrichment of Europe firsthand. So I'm very glad that we have distinguished speakers here. They're going to be in the conversation, so I'm supposed to shut up soon. So they have the floor. So let me introduce them. So on my left is Dyab Abou Jahjah. Is it the right way to pronounce it? Excellent, I practiced. It's an Arab political activist and writer, author of Identities on the Move. Dyab Abou Jahjah, born in Lebanon in 1971, immigrated to Belgium when he was 19 years old. He coordinated an immigrant organization under the Belgian Socialist Trade Union. He also earned a master's in political science from the Université Catholique de Louvain. He founded an Arab-European League in Antwerp, an anti-racism and discrimination body. The organization influenced a generation of Belgians and Dutch with immigrant roots, while Abou Jahjah faced criticism and legal challenges from the Belgian authorities. He was a columnist for the Standard, but parted ways after refusing to condemn a Palestinian attack on the Israeli soldiers. Here we might also have a difference because I have a lot of Israeli friends and I speak Hebrew, but we are here to discuss difficult issues and agree to disagree. So I'm very glad we are sitting on the same panel. In 2022, he penned Enlightenment Under Fire, reflecting on contemporary issues, including the culture war and identity politics. He continues to write columns and essays for the Morgan and Knack, appearing regularly on various TV and radio shows. And his day job is to teach actually at secondary school, and we noted that it's great to have this reality check every day and not just from time to time and talk about political theories and ideals. Now, my boss, the executive director of MCC Brussels, Professor Frank Furedi, it's a great honor to sit with you here. Professor Frank Furedi is an internationally renowned sociologist, author, and media commentator. He is Emeritus Professor of Sociology, University of Kent in Canterbury, and author of more than 25 books, which have been translated into 16 languages. His studies have been devoted to an exploration of cultural developments in Western societies. In recent years, he has published several studies on the impact of the culture wars on family life, socialization, education, and public life. So I think all of these issues would be really relevant to our conversation today. Frank regularly comments on radio, television, and the global media. So please welcome our speakers with applause. So first I thought I'd give you a chance to have your time to speak on the issues tackled during the conference. Obviously, the Yali just joined us, but this is something you've been dealing with not just in theory, but in practice. So I would like to give you a few minutes for your own remarks on the subject. So Dyab, if you could take first the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presence. Indeed, I just came from my school teaching. So indeed, I am a teacher, and this is my main activity, next to writing and thinking. And you said this very accurately. It is be a teacher, especially in a high school, with young teenagers who are at the cusp of their, let's say, transit into adult life. It is every day school for the teacher himself. So I also feel that I'm learning, not just I'm teaching my pupils. Let me just maybe cut to the chase and go into the debate of multiculturalism. Indeed, I have been busy, or I have been active around this subject for more than 25 years now, and partly because I myself am an immigrant. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I wasn't born here. I came from Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon. I was raised there, and I left Lebanon around on my own, let's say, design. When I was 19 years old. So my parents are still living in Lebanon. They did not They do not live here, so I'm a first-generation immigrant. Just like a lot of my generation, we left Lebanon after the end of the Civil War. Not during the Civil War. During the Civil War, we were active in the Civil War. I joined the militia in Lebanon when I was 13 years old. And we fought the Civil War hoping of a transition in New Lebanon, and that didn't happen. We were disappointed, we were naive, we were young. We thought our comrades died for nothing, and a lot of us left the country. Most of the Lebanese went to Switzerland, some went to Germany, few to Belgium, a lot to the United States and to Canada. So this is the migration routes of my generation. I have different generations, different routes. So multiculturalism was never actually an issue for me in Belgium. It was when I was a young man, whenever I heard multiculturalism, I would think of Lebanon, because we are, as a country, I would say, some people would say blessed, some people would say cursed, depends how you look at it, by multiculturalism. We are a multicultural country among the indigenous Lebanese. So multiculturalism in Lebanon is not an issue related to immigration. So my first nuance to bring into this debate is, this is not just related to immigration. Belgium, for example, has the issue of multiculturalism, even though you might, regardless of its immigration, even though you might say, well, it remains within one civilizational framework, Western, Northern European one. But still, I think if you speak to Flemish nationalists, who are not at all a marginal movement in this country, who are actually the mainstream, who are ruling Flanders, well, they are Flemish nationalists because they do not believe in a multiculturalist Belgium among the indigenous Belgians. They want to separate, they want an independent Flanders because they think that there's nationhood, which is Flanders, and has to be emancipated, whether you agree with them or not. It is a valid point. So that's again an issue with multiculturalism. So, but as an immigrant, when I first arrived in Belgium, I did not experience any, let's say, feelings or thoughts that could drive me into a multicultural, into a position, a political position on multiculturalism. Because when we say ism, obviously, I'm sure you have debated that before. I apologize I couldn't attend because I had to attend to my classes. And as you know, in our job, we cannot just ask a colleague to take our place. So, but I'm sure you debated the fact that multiculturalism is the ideology, and diversity as such is not an ideology. It shouldn't be made an ideology. Some people are trying to make it into an ideology. So I think my first encounter with, the notion of multiculturalism was for me just a fact that societies with a lot of migration are diversifying somehow, but I never attached a positive or negative value into it. I started noticing that some people do that when I was politicized in Belgium. I wasn't politicized in Belgium, I was politicized in Lebanon, very political. But when I came to Belgium, I had no political affinity with the country. I was politicized by the Socialist Trade Union, where I started working. And there I was instructed into the notion of a multicultural society. And I must say that, to me, it has always felt somewhat artificial, or to keep it simple, ideological. It is ideological, I believe it is ideological. I don't want to make a long story about this. I think what moved me politically in Belgium was a struggle against racism and not a struggle for a multicultural society. I don't see these two things as one and the same. For me, you can have a society that doesn't adhere to multiculturalism as a notion or as a model, and at the same time rejects racism. Nowadays, it seems as if we have to align these two together, that in order not to be racist, you have to be multiculturalist. I never really saw this thing like that. I must admit that there was a period in my activist life when I was younger, around my 30s, where I was somewhat, let's say, ambiguous about how can an anti-racist struggle materialize. And you referred to the Arab European League. The Arab European League was a very identitarian organization. It was identity politics already, but not identity politics according to the, let's say, postmodern notion of the concept. It was identity politics based on the traditional identities, nationalism and religion. So the same identity politics that nationalist parties today in Europe also adhere to, because that's also a form of identity politics. but that's the traditional one. So I was an Arab nationalist, and I was, you know, cultural Muslim. And for me, Islam was like, for many Europeans, Christianity, regardless of whether they believe in it metaphysically, yes or no, it is a foundational element of their culture and their civilization. So this is how I look at Islam still, by the way. I still look at Islam as a foundational element of my identity and my culture. So the AAL was ambiguous as an organization on, some might consider the AAL as multiculturalist, and I think there is a case to be made there. I will finish by saying, and maybe in the debate with the public we can zoom in, because it's up to you guys what you want to talk about. I don't want to hijack this session. So I just want to finish by saying, up to 10 years ago, 2009, I think is the year where I broke with nationalism, personally. I stopped calling myself a nationalist in 2009. When I was living in Lebanon, I moved to Lebanon in 2008, and I came back here in 2013. So in 2009, I stopped calling myself a nationalist after the birth of my first daughter. And there's something about fatherhood or motherhood that kind of, that can be an antidote to ideology. And I'm not per se against ideology, but sometimes some ideologies survive their time, or let's say, bypass their time and their validity date. And I believe Arab nationalism did bypass its validity time. So in 2009, I started operating out of a platform. I was still an activist there, but I was operating together with a lot of people out of a platform that is focused on citizenship and the fight against corruption, against dictatorship. That was my main, let's say, political motivation since 2009. In 2013, I came back to Belgium because of the situation there. I will spare you the details. My security was not guaranteed anymore in Lebanon because of a lot of things. And when I came back, I was surprised to see, I expected my comrades here, who have been struggling with me against racism, to have also had an evolution in their way of thinking out of identity politics, even the traditional one, into a more universalist line, which is the line where I stand today. I was surprised to see that they have radicalized further into a different kind of identity politics that is not operating out of the idea of, for example, we are Arabs and we are Muslims, and let's organize around that and see how we can talk to people based on their identity as well. That was the line of the AL. No, they have radicalized into a new form of identity politics that is focused on color, and that is focused on gender, and that is focused on aspects that, even though we recognized always as people on the left, I was, you know, not radical left, not as left as Frank has been or is or was. Yeah, he can talk about that. But still, I was on the left. We always recognized gender and color as aspects that can play a role, but they were incidental. They were never the central element of organization and mobilization. I was surprised to see that this has become the focal point of organization and activism. And since then, I grew further and further from this movement to find myself nowadays, since 3 years, maybe even 4 years, I'm considered by some of my comrades, former comrades, as somebody who almost went to the other side. But I do not experience this as such. And we can maybe talk about it a bit more. I believe there has been a shift in the cleavages and the fault lines in society. And of course I've evolved, I changed, who doesn't? But I don't believe that my shift has been so dramatical politically as people who criticize me here in Belgium today want to make people believe. I believe that society shifted so dramatically, and activists and certain ideological notions shifted so dramatically.
Thank you, this is really informative, and I think it's a good setting the field for the further discussion now. Frank, if you'd like to.
Yeah, well, just carrying on from the point that was just made, one of the things that we didn't discuss this morning that is an essential dimension of what's happening is the relationship between multiculturalism and diversity and the politicization of cultural identity. Because it seems to me that the reason why your comrades moved the way they did, and not just your comrades, but everybody who's involved in mainstream elite kind of politics is because identity is not a static concept. You know, once you define yourself by an ethnic identity or a gender identity, or the fact that you're disabled, I mean, a variety of different ways, then identity becomes your life. It is something that you breathe, and it's not separate from your private life. It's not separate from your friendship circle. It's something that is all-encompassing. And what happens is that, unfortunately, once you try to find meaning in these kinds of newly created identities, it becomes a quest forever. Because an identity that requires the validation of people around you can never be fully satisfied. And the very minute that you think that, yes, this is my identity, you'll find that you feel there's something missing, and you want more validation, you want more recognition, and identity expands into areas that were previously untouched by it. And that is why you will find that in the European public and political kind of context, identities both expand across the board, and new identities are created all the time. And you can see this, for example, in the way that gay identity begins to fracture, and all of a sudden, lesbians and male homosexuals find they have very little in common. And a day later, you have the sort of the separation between cultural lesbians and social lesbians. And similarly in feminism, you'll find that there's a large variety until you get to the point at which we are now, where you know the kind of gender affiliations continue to flourish and multiply. And this happens, you know, in all the other areas as well. There's a kind of continuous proliferation of identities, which becomes almost like the mainstay of public life. And that leads me to a point that we didn't really discuss, which is that at the end of the day, when we're discussing multiculturalism or diversity, you know, we're not discussing that in the abstract. So that multiculturalism in Europe is not like multiculturalism in Lebanon, which has grown organically over centuries, where you have different cultures, different ethnicities that have been around for a very, very long time. Multiculturalism and diversity are what I would call administratively created values. This is the key point. When values are administratively created, when they are invented, as the expression goes, they have a very different dynamic to them than when you say I'm Hungarian, or when you say that I'm Polish, or when you identify, because at that point, if you're Hungarian and Polish, you don't have to think about your identity. It's like who you are. You're going to see the difference between this kind of identity and the ones that we're discussing here. And that's best illustrated by the fact that, you know, when I go to a public meeting in America or elsewhere, people put up their hands and they introduce themselves. The first thing they say, speaking as a woman. Right? Yeah, I mean, who cares? I can see that's a woman. Right? That's the least interesting part about them, but they have to say speaking. Somebody else gets up speaking as a black activist. I can see that they're black, you know, it doesn't have to be told. Somebody says speaking as somebody who's trans this, and everybody has to give their identity as like the introduction. So in other words, you have to present the world, you have to kind of expose the world to the fact that you are speaking, not just for yourself, but to this fossilized identity that's been created. That's really what you are. And the very minute, you know, you say speaking as a woman, what you're really saying is, I need to be validated as a woman. I need to be validated and respected as a gay person. I need to be validated as a lesbian. The trouble is, once you need to be validated, once you rely on other people to recognize you and validate you, you lose, first of all, control over your own destiny, because you depend upon how people react to you. But more importantly, you politicize what you are more and more. Because now what happens is that your very existence is annihilated, is destroyed, the moment I don't respect you. So if I don't use the pronoun that you want me to use, because I think you're a man or a woman rather than Z or D or whatever you are, then I'm not just simply disagreeing with you, I'm calling your existence into question. So it's really important to realize that. And the reason why I make this point is because once we move into the domain of administratively created identities, once we have a language that is administratively constructed, then we run into a situation where people's public existence in life is quite external to them. So if you take diversity, I think that's a very good example. As somebody has suggested, there is nothing valuable about diversity. Diversity is no more valuable than homogeneity. Both of them are a description of a fact of life. Right? It's a bit like saying, you know, giving sunrise a value. We value the sun coming up in the morning. It's got that same kind of ethical or normative content. But what we've done is we've given a normative content to dimensions of our life which do not have an ethical basis to it. And that comes back to a very important question that, you know, we should have discussed in more detail. Maybe MCC Brussels will organize a conference on it, which is, what is the value? I mean, what is the value? Because the minute we ask that question, we run into a lot of trouble. So for example, in the Anglo-American world, in the pluralist Western societies, we don't just talk about value, but we talk about values. We pluralize values, which basically means that, you know, there are different ways, there are different kind of values that we need to appreciate and validate. And that's a very major problem, because if you pluralize values, like if you pluralize culture, as in multiculturalism, there can be many cultures existing side by side together, then basically what we do is we violate the very meaning of the fact that there are certain aspects of our existence that give meaning to our life and guide our existence. So when we talk about values, it's about giving meaning to life and providing a guidance to life. Now, I don't think there's anybody in this room who would argue that diversity fits that category. I mean, diversity does not give meaning to life. I mean, you've got to be an idiot to imagine that it gives meaning to life. And certainly diversity does not provide a guidance to what a good life is. It doesn't kind of play that kind of a role. So the problem that we face here is that we're captured by essentially zombie values. Yeah, there are zombie values because they're emptied of any normative content. There's no normative content in any of it, and yet we insist on turning these accomplishments, these administrative accomplishments, into real kind of values. So basically, public discussion under those circumstances becomes impossible, and which gets me back to identity politics, which is essentially based on the fact that you ghettoize and you quarantine different groups from one another, which makes it impossible to have a democratic public space. So for me, multiculturalism has a lot of problems, so does diversity. But the biggest problem with this concept is that it destroys the possibility of a genuine democracy. Because under those circumstances, there's nothing that binds citizens together. And there's not even the possibility of a common language. Because common language actually presupposes that there's a basic understanding and commitment to a certain ideal of what a good society is. A commitment to what is a good way of guiding us into the future. In other words, a common value, and not values, but a common value that kind of makes us into what we really are. And I think that for us, the really important thing is to question this language and to reappropriate a more basic language that's based organically upon certain traditional dimensions of our existence, that takes into account that there's certainly for Europeans, there's a system of ideals that evolved through centuries of struggle, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Judeo-Christian tradition, all the way to the Renaissance and Latin onwards. And we learn to speak that kind of a language that is not administratively created, but is organically evolved from a very important historical experience. And for me, my job is to historicize our public life, is to create an organic link between the present and the past, which has been ruptured. more or less, so that we can move forward in a more intelligent way.
Thank you. And I think it would be worth now to open to questions, but before I do that, I just have one question, which in a sense has got two questions in one. So I think during the conference we all agreed that the ideology of multiculturalism as it stands is a failure, and that was said before, but then it morphed into diversity, and you cannot argue with that because that would seem you are a bad person. Now, I want to contrast that between the West and the Central and Eastern Europe. So, like, we have a situation in the West, and this is what it is, and we need to move forward. So the question would be how to move beyond this multiculturalism ideology and now the diversity through administration and enforcement of putting us into boxes and policing our speech and our interaction between the groups, how we can move forward organically from bottom up. And then when it comes to Eastern and Central Europe, do they have the right to be homogeneous, or should they follow the same route? And if they have the right to be homogeneous, then how they go about it without some kind of uprising against the rest of the continent? Thank you. Dyab?
A lot of questions indeed.
Essentially 3 questions.
Apologies. I'm Polish, I just sneaked them in.
Very, very interesting nonetheless. Well, it's a very complex matter, and I don't think, you could have, because, you involve a lot of cultural, political, but also institutional elements, with the European dimension, which is not just a matter of civilization, because you could say Europe, and then, that's a civilizational entity. You can look at it as such. You can look at Europe as a geographical entity, and you can look at, when you say Europe institutionally, you're talking about the European Union, which is a treaty, basically, and which has mechanisms of consensus and dissensus. So in that sense, to start by the last answer, if you want to say, if you define homogenization of society in the sense that monocultural society is saying that, for example, if I understood it right, let's say Poland, since you're from Poland, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's assessing that any immigrant who is living legally in Poland, because we're not debating people who are not illegal, that's another debate, people who are living legally in a country must then assimilate to the Polish culture, and then that's homogenization, or is it, of course, there's another opinion which is more blunt that says no, they have to just leave, we just have to kick them out, that's like build an ethno-state. So let's assume that we're debating the last one. I'm open to debate the other one too, the deportation line. Fine, we can debate that too. But let's debate.
Assimilation.
Let's debate the assimilation line. Sure, you can enforce that in a state of law by making a law that enforces this. So in order to make a law, that's why I'm talking on the institutional line. In order to make a law, I'm not giving it still my value judgment personally. But let's say you want to do this in Europe, then you have to indeed have the checks and balances of the European structures. If that law, if you want to enforce such a law, and if you want to remain a state of law, a state under the rule of law, your own law, then you need a law for that. And if that law will force you to leave the European Union, then you need to leave the European Union for it, because you cannot, I don't think that you can impose it on the European level, that kind of approach. Now, I believe that there's a lot of ways, I'll just remain with this, that I agree when you say what Frank said at the end about you need in a society, you need a certain common ground which goes beyond the legal framework. And we need a common ground in a society that's beyond just the fact that we need to stop on a red light and that we have to, don't surpass 120 kilometers on the highway and other laws on that we shouldn't steal and kill. And we know these things. This is not what makes a society a society. This is not what makes a society a community, And we cannot thrive without creating community, communities of citizens even. Even we start not talking about national communities. Even a community of citizens, you need a common ground, which indeed requires a linguistic element, the tool to understand each other, but also more than that. I don't believe a language is enough. I think you have to go beyond that. And the problem in Europe is that these requirements are either approached in a maximalist way or a minimalist way. And the maximalist way is not feasible because it's extreme, let's be honest. If you say, we want to kick all foreigners out, yeah, that's, okay, you can say that, but, you belong to a certain club of people, that not a lot of people want to communicate with. So, but if you say, I think cultural assimilation is a necessary element for a harmonious society. Oh, that's a legitimate opinion. Whether you agree or disagree with it, the first thing we should do is to decriminalize this opinion. The problem is with the narrative that is dominant nowadays, is that it criminalizes almost this opinion, makes it a racist opinion. Okay, you say, oh, you want that. And, you know, Gildas Charles, 20 years ago, I was also somebody who would experience this out of a certain radical left approach as a kind of racist opinion. That you could argue was a multiculturalist position. Since more than 10 years, I'm defending the idea that, of course, you need to have something more than just a pure legalistic frame. And I believe if we don't take the maximalist thing, which makes it very, let's say, I want to use the word aggressive, or let's say inhumane, or unlawful. If we just take the minimalist line of that, meaning that laws on linguistic integration should be voted, preventing somebody from acquiring a nationality in a European country if they do not attain a certain level of mastering the national language. That's very possible under the European Union. If that's not voted, I'm sorry, it's because local politicians are cowards. Because you're under European law, you can do that. You can say, to acquire the Belgian nationality, you need to speak French or Dutch or one of the national languages perfectly, or attend the level of, European has this level, the C and the A and the B. You have to attend the C level in Dutch, for example. Why not? Why don't you do that? Second element, some countries do it like that. So in Belgium, for example, we don't have that, which is a problem. And the second element, in the United States of America and Canada, both of them are not considered to be bigoted extreme right countries. Especially the United States, requires that you study its history, that you study its constitution, that you swear, that you take a pledge or oath. How do they call it, the Americans?
Allegiance.
Yeah, towards the flag. And well, if you want to build a national community, maybe that's not a bad idea to do. If you want to make the signal, when I was 20 years old and I arrived to this country at 19 years old, and when I became Belgian 6 or 7 years afterwards, nobody asked me to take any pledge. Nobody asked me anything. Okay, I was in front of a judge, and the judge asked me, he spoke to me in Dutch, so he could hear that I'm speaking Dutch. He asked me if I had a job. I had a job, and he said, okay, I see that you're integrated now. In my case, maybe that's considered a hard judge. In some cases, people do not speak the language, and they don't maybe know in what country they live, and if you want to belong to the club, you have to know, first of all, imagine when I join a football club, you have at least to know the name of the club. You have to know the game you're playing. You cannot go to a football club and play volleyball. Because they say, hey, guys, you play football, but I want to play volleyball. No. So these things are not extremist position. The problem is, nowadays, these things are problematized, and these demands can only be advanced or vocal. They became vocal only with a political program that sometimes goes much beyond that. So it makes it easy to those who do not want to talk about that, who wants to make this also sound racist. I know it's just a little part of your question, but I will stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really brought home to me when 5 or 6 years ago, I was reading about how in Holland, the way they tried to integrate people who didn't feel Dutch was by getting them to do things like looking at pictures of naked Dutch people running around on a beach to demonstrate that the people in Holland are very liberal and open and everything else. That's the point where I realized that Holland had a big problem. Because it being Dutch meant taking your clothes off, then that really wasn't a valid way of establishing a common community. And I think that there's something artificial that is sometimes tried as a way of dealing with a very manifest kind of problem. But I think that the important thing for me, and I come back to this all the time, is what does it mean to be Belgian? What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be Hungarian? Now, if you take the case of Hungary, and I'm not an expert in Hungarian history, but Hungary did not begin its existence thousands of years ago by being a homogeneous Hungarian community. There's a lot of people who moved into Hungary, they interacted with each other, they gradually developed a common religion, they gradually developed a common way of being, They began to eat the same kind of food and everything else, and from that, gradually you had what you could call today a homogeneous Hungarian society. But the importance of our Hungary is not that it's homogeneous, because that's just a descriptive phenomenon. The really important thing about Hungary, as far as I can tell, is that people feel Hungarian. You know, so the feeling, you know, that kind of is within their hearts and within their soul that makes them into Hungarian. And that you cannot do by, you know, in Hungary giving people pictures of people dancing the csárdács, you know, sort of, or forcing people to eat paprika stew or anything of that sort. That would be a very funny way of doing these kind of things. There's got to be a way in which society is organically sort of evolves, as opposed to the way in which values and ways of being are artificially imposed on people. Now, the logic, for me, the key thing is that at the end of the day, what Poland is, what Hungary is, or what Sweden is, it's not a philosophical question, it's not a political question, it's something that ought to be determined by Hungarians or Poles or Swedes. That's the key element. So if Hungarians decide that they don't want any migration into Hungary, because they've seen what happened, let's say, in Leicester or Bradford, or they've seen what happened in Malmö in Sweden or a whole lot of other places, and they say, well, that's good for the Swedes, let them enjoy that kind of experience, that's really good for other societies. That's their right to decide that this is the kind of society they want to create. And therefore, at the end of the day, when we think about the EU, the key thing that is the most important and the most wonderful alternative to multiculturalism and diversity is the principle of sovereignty, the principle of national sovereignty. Because the principle of national sovereignty is not just simply about nation and nationalism. National sovereignty is the foundation on which a democratic public can establish itself. Without national sovereignty, you cannot have citizens. You cannot have a sense of public life. And I think that's the key thing that we're trying to defend here. And to me, it's a package. All these things are interlinked with each other. And the minute we try to interfere from outside, as the way that the EU at the moment is trying to do, then all you can do is to disrupt and dislocate a kind of society that's evolved by itself without the need for expert technocratic advice by these wonderful bureaucrats hanging out just around the corner from here.
Thank you, Frank. So I would like to open the floor to questions. Are there any questions? Here, gentleman there.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Abou Jahjah. I'm a very big admirer of you already for many years. Finally, I can meet you in the flesh. I was looking forward to this moment for a long time ago. Maybe one of the reasons that explains my fascination with you is that we belong to the same minority. Might surprise you, but we are both Flemish speakers in Brussels. And as you know, us as Flemish speakers, we are a particular sort of minority here in Brussels that is maybe treated a bit differently than other minorities. To give you an example, there was a liberal politician in Molenbeek last week. She herself is from Romanian descent, and she said, oh, we really have to address the problem of the influx of Flemish migrants in Molenbeek because they are gentrifying the area, and this is bad for Muslims. So Molenbeek is becoming cleaner and more safe, and this is a problem that needs to be addressed. If you would say this about any other ethnic group, I think there would be much more outcry about this. Also, treatment of our common group, because I consider you to be Flemish, is, for instance, as you might remember, they changed the tunnel, the Leopold II tunnel, because of course Leopold II did atrocious things in Congo, nobody will deny that. But we were never having a discussion, for instance, about Place Roger. Roger was the first Prime Minister of Belgium who said, we need to eradicate the Germanic element in Belgium. There's just no problem that one of the biggest squares in Brussels is named after this person. We have a very big statue of Cardinal Mercier, the cardinal during the First World War, who said that the Flemish are destined to serve and the French speakers are destined to lead. Nobody is raising the issue that this is a statue that needs to be cancelled and needs to be taken down. So my question to you is, you as a fellow Flemish Brusseler like me, how would you explain the difference in treatment that we as an ethnic minority have in Brussels is different than the ones of the many others in this very multicultural city? Thank you for your time.
Yeah, let's do it maybe one by one quickly. Is that right, or would you like to gather a few questions?
We gather a few questions.
Okay. Alka?
Yeah, it's a question.
Wait for the microphone, it's coming.
A question to, well, Frank, but both of you. How do you see us arriving at a core value that defines us? What sphere of activity? Who will decide? What value would you hold?
Okay, great. Any more questions here, please? Second row, the front.
Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. I will react to or take the point that Frank made about introducing oneself, speaking as a woman, speaking as a whatever it is, a gay man. I have a similar experience with the gender agenda in the parliament and how many politicians or public figures identify themselves only as their sexual orientation or gender identity, thereby, I think, narrowing their identity and trying to force others to only look at that in them. Whereas a person and a personality is so much more than just his or her sexuality or preferences. In a larger way, in the EU today, in Brussels, I see this also as multiculturalism, this diversity, religion kind of thing, which really narrows the path, I think. A lot of people feel uncomfortable in Brussels or in the EU today because they don't want this to be forced upon them, this ideology, this narrow-minded, compulsory value, and reminds us, Hungarians and others, of the Soviet time, that was the accepted value system that everybody had to accept. So what is beyond multiculturalism? That's my question to both of you. Where do we go from here, and how do we do it?
Right. One more?
Thank you. I think this is a little related to that on the where do we go, because I was very taken, Frank, with what you said about how it's not possible to sort of artificially impose through language tests or learning about history. Those things don't really pull people together to have that sort of sense of what it is to be a homogenous group. But it sort of begs the question of whether there is anything that can actually be done to try to encourage that. And I'm struck that I spent quite a lot of time in a rural area of Italy, and talking to locals there, they have a very strong sense of what it is to be Italian is to be pro-family. And even though their birth rates are falling through the floor, they still regard pro-family as being what it is to be Italy. So what I'm saying is that sort of sense people have, being pro-Italian, is being Italian. It's what people think, what people feel, what people have a sense of what they are. And it seems to me it's very difficult to introduce that.
All right, thank you very much. So shall we go back to the first question on the Flemish speakers in Brussels and the complexity of politics, but also history and revising the history in public life?
Yes, thank you very much for considering me a Flemish. That is something that I appreciate, and I am aware of the fact that I belong also. I think it's my destiny belonging to different ethnic minorities. In that sense, I'm intersectional. But I would like, in Lebanon, I'm a part of a majority, so it depends. Yeah, I can fully understand. If you permit me to call this frustration in a way, I mean it is, And I feel, I don't have to claim that I feel it the same way as you do, because I believe there is still a difference between the native and the, let's say, adopted Flemish, emotionally at least, if we are honest. I think for you it must be more difficult than it is for me, but I am provoked by it. I am provoked by it, even though that for me, let's say on the emotional level, I can switch between French and Dutch doesn't mean much to me, but I always imagine how would Flemish friends of mine feel about that. There is a problem in Brussels, and I think this problem is part of the long history of Belgium, and it's, let's say, the cultural and political and social clash that has been very, let's say, extreme in the past, where I could fully support the Flemish movement. I always say the Flemish movement has been an emancipation movement for most of its history. However, where maybe we disagree is, I feel today this is more a Brussels phenomenon, and your question is on point, and Brussels is a big problem still. I believe on the level of Belgium, the Flemish question, I believe personally, is solved. I believe, of course, Flemish people can aspire to independence, that's legitimate, but I don't believe the Flemish are oppressed. We can debate about that. I believe they're even the dominant ethnicity in Belgium, you know, economically, politically. Of course, they have a point when they say we are underrepresented in parliament. The seats distribution does not follow the demographical line. That is a valid point. But in Brussels we have a problem, yes. In Brussels we have a problem because the people dominating Brussels still cherish an attitude that is anti-Flemish. And this is a reality in Brussels. And I wouldn't say Flemish is the most discriminated against community in Brussels, because luckily there's Flandern that has its own, you know, the Vlaamse gemeenschap, the Flemish community in Brussels has a structure, and there's a lot of money that is also invested in the Flemish culture and so on from Flanders. But on the other hand, I think it's a target that the French-speaking politicians sometimes in Brussels like to shoot at, because you score, when you attack Flemish people in Brussels, you score political points. On the point of gentrification,
exactly,
yeah.
I think that was a very interesting point, just to finish off.
If you had asked me these questions also 10 years ago, I would have agreed with the lady in question. I would have, because I was a big opponent of gentrification, which is a classical trope of the left, the radical left, and I was part of that. Let's say ideologically, I was fully in that paradigm. You know, 10 years later, I think it is one of the points where I have a full paradigm shift. I am now a supporter of gentrification. I believe.
Like on the question of like Flemish, like they influence on the majority Muslim area, and I found that kind of quite amusing. That, you know, the politicians, they need to have a say into how people mix and how does it influence them between the groups.
Exactly, especially when you know that I live in Molenbeek, and the Muslim people living in Molenbeek are very happy when Flemish come to live in their neighborhood. Okay, so this is a problem of the politicians who are trying to score with the white French-speaking electorate in Brussels. Okay, they're not trying to score with the Muslims, because the Muslims, what do they see when Flemish people? For example, I live in Molenbeek, you know, and I talk with my neighbors, and we say, oh, there's more and more Belgians live here. That's good for the value of our houses. That's good for the schools. That's good because why? They are upper middle class mostly, you know. So, okay, economically speaking, forget culture. Economically speaking, alone is a plus point. So nobody's annoyed in real life by gentrification. Only politicians who want to show that they are anti-Flemish. So even this lady is not annoyed by gentrification. If she's honest, she will also, if you look where she lives, she will be living in the nice streets of Molenbeek that are very gentrified. But she knows that's the way to score.
Yeah.
Just on that, I mean, I'm not Flemish, by the way, so. But one of the things that I know from my understanding of Belgium and history is that, for better or worse, Flemish identity is what I would call a slightly pathologized identity. So when you look at identity politics, where there's a hierarchy of different identities, then basically Flemish identity is on a lower scale than, let's say, other identities in the way that people talk to me. So even though, you know, sort of I've only been here a short time in Brussels, when people talk to me about, you know, non-Flemish people who come with the Flemish, you get the impression that they regard them as a bunch of peasants, not as sophisticated compared to the rest of society, even though it's wrong and weird, because Flanders is more developed economically and other respects than the Walloon areas at the moment. That's the way it is. But this leads me to a very important point that we haven't discussed, which is the demand for the validation of identity, which is inherent in multiculturalism, also has other side to it. Because the minute you want some identities to be validated, you want others to be invalidated. So what we have is what in sociology we call spoiled identities. Identities that are regarded as a lower moral plane than others. So for example, heterosexuality is now seen as really much more boring and much less sensitive than other forms of sexuality. If you have the way that masculinity is talked about. You know, when I was young, my mom really wanted to be a masculine man, and they talked about masculinity as a positive attribute, whereas masculinity today is linked to a word called toxic. So we have toxic masculinity. And you can go through a number of different identities that are spoiled or pathologized identity. And I think that the Flemish identity really comes down on that as being part and parcel of that. So that some people in Europe are regarded as admirable and really great. They're usually the most woke people imaginable. And then the other communities are regarded as a kind of embarrassment to the European way of life.
Mm-hmm. Now, Frank, would you like to answer the questions about how we will be able to define the core values if we are to move forward?
Well, the minute you have to define core values, they're no longer values. I mean, that's the big problem. It's like, you know, the minute you're going to define what it means to be a Christian, you know, you're not a Christian anymore. Or if you're Jewish or Muslim, the minute it becomes an abstract question, what these things really mean, then basically means that you don't really know who you are, and you don't know what we're about. And that's the predicament, the existential predicament of European societies today. So how do we resolve that? I think, again, the way we resolve it is by historicizing our existence. So whenever I talk to young people, I try to do a lot of lectures with 17, 18-year-olds. I don't tell them I'm going to give you the core values that you should live by. I start talking about Aristotelian virtues, right, which I think are really quite important. You begin with the Aristotelian, you know, sort of conceptions of how he saw what a good life, of human flourishing is really all about. And you start talking about the importance of this. But I don't tell them that you gotta, you know, sort of artificially embrace the list of these Aristotelian virtues any more than any other values. I just talk about the importance of understanding that this is part of our heritage. So I prefer to talk about our heritage, our legacy, our traditions that are really quite central to making us who we are, because our existence depends on the experience of those other people thousands of years ago, rather than giving a list of core values. But I have favorite, you know, values, and courage being number one. I think the value of courage in the Aristotelian sense is the one thing that is really missing in Western Europe, and you know, Western Europe could do with taking seriously again courage as an important dimension of their moral orientation.
Mm. Dyab, I was thinking maybe you would be able to answer the question in relation to that a lot of people in all of this professional settings, so the examples from the parliament, they don't really agree with what's happening, but they somehow keep their head down. How is it for you? Because obviously you work in the education system, so that's also probably shoved down your throat. How do you deal with that? I also seen that you doing your own training on diversity and inclusion, so fascinating. So how do you approach it?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
well,
Shame on you.
oh, you know, look, I always say that we are living in a hegemony, a new hegemony, to use Gramsci's terms, which I think are very valid, because people who are imposing this hegemony are also schooled a bit in this narrative, even though they kind of spoil it completely. But we have a hegemony of these postmodern, let's say, what people use woke to describe often values. And this hegemony, why is it a hegemony? Because hegemony is not a regime. A hegemony is above the regime. I was recently speaking to a very highly placed politician in the Flemish government. I will not say the name because I see cameras here, so it was was a private conversation. And I was at his office, and I said the guy is very powerful. I mean, maybe the most powerful in the country, apart his boss. You know who I'm talking about, probably. So, and I noticed I had to go to the bathroom, and I noticed that it was neutral gender, and it was putting this gender neutral, right? And I came back to the gentleman, and I said, sir, I couldn't help but notice that your bathroom is genderly neutral, and for the last hour here that we were talking, you were complaining to me about this kind of ideology that's dominant. And he said to me, he said, do you think I can change that? There's nobody above this guy in the Flemish government, okay? And I believe him, he's honest. So this is hegemony for you. Hegemony is when the top politician of a country cannot change the fact that the toilet in his own cabinet to say in Dutch, office is gender neutral. He doesn't like it, but he cannot change it. That is not politics, that's not democracy, that's not voted, that's hegemony. So we live under that. On the other hand, if I want to talk out of my own experience, I think people who are working on the ground, teachers especially among each other, they know what's real and what's fake. So they can recognize ideology immediately. So even though we see it in our curriculum sometimes, you know, we look at each other, we say, nah, we're not gonna teach this. And our director also is a very wise man. I don't think he also is very enthusiastic on teaching us certain things. He let us choose. Now, our Minister of Education lets us choose too, because he belongs to a party, which will never be my party. I don't vote on these people, so I'm not like applauding the guy, but on this, I agree. I feel protected, and this can be on the record, I feel, when it comes to woke hegemony, I feel protected by the NVA, which is the nationalist Flemish party that is now governing Belgium. And okay, I don't think I will ever vote on that NVA for other reasons. But on this reason, for as long as they are in power, you know, I think they can shelter us a bit from that. So I know for sure if there was another political party in power, whether it's the socialists or the Greens, or even Christian Democrats and liberals who do not have the backbone, even when they do not agree, but they do not have the backbone to stand up to that, they will not turn a blind eye on what we're doing, because even the NVA cannot go as far as saying, no, we reject this, we will not put it in our curriculum. In our curriculum, you have intersectionality. You know, we have, when I say I'm not teaching this because it's an ideological notion, my colleagues can do if they want. I can teach ideological notions. I teach history and citizenship, which gives me a lot of range of freedom to my pupils. But nowadays I can do that because the political level in Flandern kind of turns a blind eye, but they cannot. This is very important. That's the maximum they can do, turn a blind eye. They cannot enforce the removal of such thing. They cannot enforce the removal of the gender-neutral thing on their toilet in their own offices. So there is a hegemony, and I'm not going to be apocalyptic and say at the end of the world we cannot see anything. No, we can still talk, but I believe, lately I was on a TV show talking about, because they want to introduce on the French-speaking side, they want to introduce this gender education to very young kids, actually, children. And they are actually introducing, I checked the guide that they want to use as a platform or as a paradigm to you, and it's gender ideology in its maximalist form. You know, teaching kids that maybe you're born in 5 years old. They want to start. They did not get that this time, but they're planning to get it. You know, they got from the 11 years old now. Okay, they can teach to 11 years old already that maybe you're born in a girl's body, but maybe you are not a girl. I was on TV, and I said to the journalist, it was funny, I went to the Flemish and the French-speaking TV in 2-3 days, and the difference on the hegemony level, on the Flemish TV, the journalist, when I said, no one is born in the wrong body, that is nonsense, that is non-scientific, it's impossible scientifically. I cannot teach this to my students because I am obliged to teach them science. So you cannot ask me to teach them that the earth is round. And not flat. You cannot expect me to teach them about biology and about evolution, and then when it comes to gender, you expect me to tell them that you may be born in your own body. This is pseudoscientific, nonsensical. And then the journalist was saying, I said, no, he said, oh, you are on thin ice now. So, okay? And mind you, I know the guy, the journalist, and I know he agrees with me. But he has to pose and to say, you are on thin ice. Now, 2 days later, I was on French-speaking television on the same issue,
and the journalist practically did not let me speak. All I said is, the notion is contested. Okay, I said the notion is, I started like that. I said the notion is contested. They said, no, it's not contested. It is factual. I said it is contested scientifically, medically, and all our level. Gender dysphoria is a condition. And I used a term that might be provocative. I agree. But that I believe in. I said it is a psychological deviation, which does not bear any judgment on value. It's a psychological deviation, like for example, you might consider that writing with the left hand is also a deviation, for example, you know. But of course, he attacked me on that, but he kept silencing and he said, you cannot say that. And obviously, there is a hegemony, and I think this is why. And it's difficult to deal with the hegemony because if you don't like politics, you say, I will vote for another party. If all parties undergo the hegemony and nobody dares to contest it, then you wonder where is it coming from. It's surely not coming from parliaments. It's surely not coming from the European Parliament neither. Where is it coming from? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I believe there is some kind, and this is where I believe that there is some kind of symbiosis, I don't know if this is an English word, between a certain globalist, corporatist tendency, you can analyze why they think like that, we want to impose a certain line, and let's say media and people who have a lot of influence in places. And I want just to finish with something. I'm afraid, Frank, when you say, and I agree with you, you cannot define values when you are talking on the European level, because Europeans don't share the same values always. What they share is the same sense of politics that is actually based in certain rules and certain ways of looking at tolerance and freedoms and democracies and so forth. But you say, I mean, European, if you go to Greece, you talk with people, they will talk about Western people. The Greece, they will talk about Western people. I think people in Eastern Europe and Central, there is a value shift in Europe. What you can do that on the national level. And that is why I believe the only way to counter, let's say, a certain narrative or a certain hegemony is by redefining clearly national values. I think Hungarians can define common values that are linked to their identity, while on the European level it's very difficult to do that. I don't think Europe has that. I think Europe has some notion of aspiration or some, you know, what people might have creedal identity based on the Enlightenment and all that, but Europe does not have values in the sense of national values, identity values, just like Hungarians do, Polish people do, Germans maybe do, and so on.
We're slightly out of time, so if we just do the closing remarks now, that would be great. We will continue the conversation with a glass of wine afterwards, so don't think I'm sending you home.
Yeah.
Not allowed.
All right, well, two things. One is that hegemony is not a fixed phenomenon, which is where the idea of courage that I mentioned is really quite important, because if that minister had balls, you know, sort of had a bit of, you know, what we call balls in the English language, or what Aristotle calls courage, then he could use his power to challenge that. And it only takes a few politicians, a few leading figures, to set an example and to basically say that the emperor has got no clothes, to begin to create a new dynamic. But the trouble is, if you have politicians who hide behind, you know, their position and self-censor, then of course nothing would change. And to me, that's a position that we've got to challenge completely, not become collaborators, which is what a lot of people have become, collaborators on all this, but see things in a much more dynamic way. I just want to say basically that you're a little bit wrong about European values. I think that the national values of all societies that I know of in Europe also have, in a sense, internalized a certain European spirit that binds together the Greeks, which are far away in the Balkans, with the Finns all the way up north and beyond Scandinavia. And those European values are very, very real, and they're very real to me. The reason why I live in Europe rather than Canada, where my parents emigrated, is because first of all, I felt European. And what Europe was to me was this incredible historical journey that occurred, that provided these incredible intellectual and moral resources on which different nations draw differently. So obviously there are national cultures, there are national values, but they are very much linked. And Hungary would not be Hungary. It would be a very different country if it didn't see itself as the guardian of European values. I mean, that might be strange to non-Hungarians, seeing yourself as in some shape or form, in a sense, defined by your Europeanness. And there are many historical reasons for that. But those values, it seems to me, are the essential foundation on which national cultures can thrive. And all of us in Europe, even though our nation is the most important focus of our loyalty, have to draw on this incredibly important intellectual developments and moral developments that occurred over the centuries, which in a sense are unique. I mean, when I talk to my students and they say, why is Europe Europe? And so I talk about things like, Europe is the only world where for centuries before modern era, there's a clear distinction between the secular and the temporal on the one hand and the religious on the other hand. The whole division of Europe between the papacy and the secular leaders was absolutely crucial for certain kind of very important developments. I cannot think of any other part of the world that had that. It doesn't mean that Europe is necessarily morally better, but it is a very important starting point for a number of developments that are very much alive, at least in an intellectual sense today, but which are really scared to embrace. So I just want to end up by talking about courage, and courage in the Aristotelian sense, or in the sense that I use it, doesn't mean that you're strong and you beat people up and all the rest of that, but courage is a moral accomplishment. It's a very important, powerful moral accomplishment, which basically means that you're prepared to act on your beliefs, you're prepared to defend those beliefs, and you don't really take no for an answer when existential questions are really raised, which is something that I find totally missing at the moment amongst the political class. But some people who are not in the political class still practice it and still have it.
Mm-hmm. Dyab, would you like to add anything to the courage that we need to stand up and to stand up for what is right?
Yes, on that I agree totally.
Keeping quiet.
Yeah, I agree that you totally with Frank. I would have acted differently, but it's easy to talk because I'm not in that position, but I think I agree with you on that. So it's necessary, that courage. However, where I disagree, I would like to talk about, or end with maybe like a general note. Where I disagree is still on that notion of European values. If I look at European values, indeed, I agree with you, there's maybe something in common, but the things multiculturalism, that's one debate on the side. I think, to say that fastly, when this is a debate that is going on not only in Europe, this is going also in Turkey for the moment, in Lebanon, and a lot of countries, okay? I believe nobody likes multiculturalism, really, except the immigrants. We like multiculturalism because it makes our life easier, okay? But no indigenous, when I'm in Lebanon, I don't like multiculturalism, and this hypocrisy somewhat made me say, okay, why should I then like it when I'm in Belgium? Why? Because it serves me well? No. My integrity did not allow me of sticking to that. After living so long in Lebanon and feeling indigenous there, I came back saying, like, I have to be fair. What I don't like there, I shouldn't like here. So nobody likes multiculturalism. It's a defiance. It's a challenge always. It's not, so it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's bad, it's a challenge. Nobody likes challenges. People like easy life. Communities, also nations, they like easy life. They don't like complexity. Already marrying somebody from the same culture is already complicated enough because it's another person and it's another gender. You have to talk to them. Imagine living together. So it's a challenge. The bad news is, for all indigenous population, and as I said, here maybe I'm a minority, as a Lebanese I'm a majority. And we have more than 50% for the moment, or around 50% of people living in Lebanon are not Lebanese. So this debate is everywhere. So the bad news for indigenous people, including me there, but not me here, is it's not going anywhere. The future is that of hybridity and diversity. And it's bad news. I'm not saying that's good news. It's bad because it has a sense of, how do you say that? Alienation in it for the indigenous. I feel alienation in Lebanon when I'm walking in Beirut and I barely hear Lebanese dialect. I have to finish. So we have to manage it in a way to lead to a society that can function. And therefore, I just finish with what I said initially. We need to set clear rules in order to keep a minimum of harmony within these societies and not to disintegrate. Of course, we can say, we want ethnic states and homogeneous societies. You can try it. It's not going to work. It's going to lead to conflict within the countries. It's going to lead to conflict among the countries. It's going to lead. What will work and what can work is the clear, courageous policy, setting clear rules, saying, in my books I speak of the native claim, honoring the native claim. What is the native claim is? This country has a language. This country has a history. This country, well, any country, this country has a certain national sense. And this has to be part of the contract, of the social contract that we all sign together as citizens. This is not optional. This is not something you can take or leave. If you want to join the club, these are the rules of the game. This is possible. We can do this. That's what I believe in.
Thank you.
Except for one thing, that rules and laws lack moral depth. That's the problem. And if you rely on rules and the law, then basically, as they say in English, you're fucked. That is the experience. There's going to be a certain moral underpinning on which these things are based. And the experience is that in America and Canada, where there are plenty of rules, but there's no sense of commonality.
Yeah. We should work on a culture too, not only on the legal level. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.